Chapter 1. The Weight of a Name. The smell of bleach was a monster that tried to crawl inside Annie's nose and live there. It was sharp, angry, a scent that wanted to erase everything. She pushed the scrub brush harder against the grimy floor of the pack kitchen, her knuckles screaming. The gray stone was stubborn, holding on to yesterday's grease and dirt like a secret. A fat, ugly secret. This was her life, because her father had made a choice a long time ago. A bad one. Now she was the one paying for it, on her hands and knees. Happy 25th birthday to me. Around her, the kitchen was alive. It was a buzzing, laughing thing filled with people who belonged. 2 she-wolves, barely 18, giggled by the cooling racks, sneaking bits of warm bread. Their laughter was a bright, sharp sound that made something in Annie's chest feel tight and old. They didn't look at her. Nobody ever really looked at her. It was better that way, she told herself. Being invisible was a kind of armor. A thin, crappy armor, but still. You can't hit what you can't see, right? At least, that's the story she sold herself every morning. This was a world of muscle and magic, of moon-blessed warriors and their mates. They were wolves, powerful, proud, and she was the girl who scrubbed their floors. Her wolf had never shown itself, a quiet, sleeping thing deep inside her. Another reason she was less, another mark of her father's stain on her soul. Her existence was a quiet apology for a crime she didn't commit. She could feel their eyes slide over her, then away, as if looking too long might infect them with her bad luck. A deep voice cut through the noise. "Smells like a hospital in here? Trying to scrub the stink of traitor off the stones, Annie?" The voice belonged to Marcus, one of the pack's enforcers. He was built like a brick house with a mean streak just as wide. He didn't wait for an answer, just laughed a loud, ugly sound. His friends joined in. The sound bounced off the stone walls surrounding her. Each laugh felt like a tiny stone being thrown at her skin. She didn't look up. She just kept scrubbing. 1, 2, 3. The bristles scraped a rhythm against the floor. Don't cry. Don't scream. Don't give them anything. That was her mantra. Because giving them a reaction was like handing them a knife. Beyond the insults and the endless work, a whisper had been traveling through the pack for weeks. A stupid, hopeful little rumor that clung to the air like smoke. On the 25th year, fate marks who it wants. A myth. A fairy tale told to young wolves about how the moon goddess herself sometimes steps in, pairing the unlikely, forging bonds of impossible strength. For most, it was just a fun story. For Annie, it was a joke. Fate hadn't just ignored her, it seemed to actively hate her. The idea that it would suddenly choose her for anything but more misery was so funny, it almost made her want to scream. Why would fate choose the girl whose name was a curse? It made no sense. It was a fool's hope. She dipped the brush back into the bucket of murky water. The cold liquid stung the raw skin on her hands. She thought of her father, a man she barely remembered, a face in a faded photograph. He had been the Alpha's most trusted warrior, his best friend, and then he betrayed them all. He sold pack secrets to a rival, a sin that got him killed, and his family branded forever. Her mother had faded away from shame not long after, leaving Annie to grow up in the shadow of his ghost. She was a living reminder of the pack's greatest wound because a wolf pack's strength is built on loyalty. Absolute, unbreakable loyalty. Her father had shattered that, and the pieces had cut her ever since. What could she possibly be chosen for except to carry that weight? The kitchen bell rang, signaling the end of the morning shift. The others started to clean up, their movements light and easy. They were heading off to train, or run, or just live their lives. Annie slowly, painfully, got to her feet. Her whole body ached, not just from the work, but from a deep, settled kind of tired that lived in her bones. She dumped the dirty water outside, the grimy liquid splashing onto the ground. It felt right. All the dirt and ugliness poured out. If only she could do that with her own soul. She knew she had to get through this day. She just had to survive until the sun went down on her stupid, meaningless birthday. As she walked away from the kitchens, heading towards the small, lonely room she called home, the whisper followed her on the wind. Fate marks who it wants. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself, a bitter smile touching her lips. Let it try. Chapter 2. An unseen storm. The main courtyard was the heart of the Packlands, a wide open space of packed earth and stone where announcements were made and justice was served. It was a place Annie avoided. Today, she had no choice. The path to her room cut right across a corner of it. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the dusty ground in front of her, trying to move like a ghost. Be small. Be silent. Disappear. Her feet barely made a sound. It was a skill she had perfected over years of trying not to be noticed. But then the world went quiet. It wasn't a normal silence. It was a heavy, thick quiet that pressed in on her ears. Every bit of chatter, every laugh, every footstep just stopped. A wave of raw power washed over the courtyard, raising the tiny hairs on her arms. It was like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for permission to move again. Annie knew what it was. She knew who it was. She didn't have to look up, but she did. Her body betrayed her, her head lifting against her will. There he was. Alpha Ethan. He strode from the great hall, moving with a predator's grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. He was tall, built with the hard, lean muscle of a warrior who had fought for his title and never lost. His dark hair was a little too long, brushing against the collar of his black jacket. His face could have been carved from stone, all sharp angles and harsh lines. But it was his eyes that held the world captive. They were the color of old gold, fierce and intelligent, and holding a coldness that could freeze you from 20 paces away. He was the most powerful man she had ever seen, because his power wasn't just in his title. It was in every single cell of his body. Walking beside him, almost touching his arm, was Lori. She was his beta, second in command, and everything Annie was not. Lori was stunning, with a river of blonde hair and a smile that could be sweet or sharp, depending on who it was for. Right now, aimed up at Ethan, it was possessive. A clear, silent message to everyone watching. He is mine. She said something to him, her voice too low for Annie to hear, and he gave a short, sharp nod. He didn't smile. Annie wasn't sure she had ever seen him smile. Annie's heart started to beat a frantic, stupid rhythm against her ribs. Look away. Just look away. But she couldn't. It was like watching a storm gather on the horizon. You knew it was dangerous. You knew you should take cover. But you couldn't stop staring at the dark, swirling beauty of it all. He was the alpha. He held the lives of everyone here in his hands, including hers. He could have her cast out with a single word. That power, that absolute control, should have made her hate him. And she did. She hated what he represented. She hated the system that put him on a throne and her on the floor. Yet, as he got closer, something pricked at the edge of her senses. Underneath the scent of pine and cold mountain air that always seemed to surround him, there was something else. Something broken. It was a faint, almost unnoticeable dissonance in his perfect aura of power. For a split second, as he passed under the shadow of an awning, she saw it in his face. A flicker of deep hidden pain in those golden eyes. His hand, hanging by his side, was clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles were white. It was a crack in the marble statue. A tiny sign that the powerful, untouchable alpha was fighting a war no one could see. What could possibly hurt a man like him? Then his gaze swept across the courtyard. It was a casual, dismissive glance, the look of a king surveying his territory. His eyes passed over faces, over buildings, and then they landed on her. It was only for a second. A heartbeat. There was no recognition. To him, she was just another shadow, another piece of the background. But the force of that brief look felt like a physical blow. It was like being seen for the first time and wished away in the same instant. A jolt went through her, hot and electric, and she couldn't breathe. It wasn't attraction. It was something deeper, something primal and terrifying that whispered of things she didn't understand. Just as quickly, he was gone, heading towards the training grounds with Lori at his side. The silence broke. The world started moving again, people talking and breathing as if the storm had passed. But Annie stood frozen, her feet rooted to the ground. Her heart was still hammering against her ribs. The spot where his eyes had touched her skin felt like it was burning. She had spent her whole life trying to be invisible, and in 1 second, the most powerful man in their world had seen her, and it felt like she had been stripped bare. A desperate urge to run, to get away from these walls and these people flooded her. She had to get out, even if it was just for a few hours. Chapter 3. A Fall into Darkness. The bar was called the Rusty Trap, and it lived up to its name. It sat on the very edge of the Pack's territory, a place for those who wanted to forget what they were for a few hours. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, regret, and cheap whiskey. It was perfect. Annie slid onto a wobbly bar stool in the darkest corner, the cracked vinyl cool against her skin. She ordered a whiskey, neat. The amber liquid burned a welcome trail down her throat, a fire that pushed back the cold loneliness that was always trying to settle in her chest. 1 drink became 2, then 3. The blurry comfort of the alcohol began to soften the sharp edges of her day. For a little while it worked. The whispers in her head grew quiet. The memory of the Alpha's golden eyes faded to a dull glow. Here, she was just a girl in a bar, not the traitor's daughter, not the Pack's ghost. She was nobody, and it felt almost like being free. She could pretend she had a different life, a different name. A life where her 25th birthday might have meant cake and friends, not cheap whiskey and a heavy heart. It was a fragile fantasy, because a world built on alcohol is as sturdy as a house of cards. The fantasy shattered when the door swung open, letting in a gust of cold night air and a ripple of laughter. Annie didn't need to look. She recognized the scent of expensive perfume and smug satisfaction. Lori, of course. She walked in with 2 of her friends, their heads held high, their eyes scanning the room like queens looking over their grubby subjects. And then, Lori's bright blue eyes landed on Annie. A slow, cruel smile spread across her perfect face. Oh, this was a gift. Continuing as if nothing had happened, Lori and her friends took a table nearby, their voices deliberately loud. "Can you believe some people have nowhere else to go?" one of them said, loud enough for Annie to hear every word. Lori laughed, a sound like tinkling glass. "Some people don't deserve anywhere else to go. Filth just attracts more filth, doesn't it?" Annie gripped her glass, her knuckles turning white. "Ignore them. They're just mean girls. They can't hurt you." But the whiskey had worn down her defenses, leaving her nerves raw and exposed. Lori finally decided to stop playing games. She sauntered over to the bar, leaning gracefully against it right next to Annie. "Well, well, Annie. Celebrating your big day all alone?" Her voice was sweet, like honey laced with poison. 25 is a big one for us, you know, the age of fate." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I guess fate knew not to waste its time with you." The bartender looked away, suddenly very busy polishing a clean glass. No one ever stood up for the traitor's daughter, because defending her would be like admitting you sympathized with her father's crime. "Leave me alone, Lori," Annie managed to say, her voice low and shaky. "Oh, but I'm just trying to be friendly," Lori pouted, a fake look of concern on her face. "I just feel so sorry for you. Your father, well, we all know what he was. It must be so hard carrying that around, knowing you're cut from the same rotten cloth." That was it, the final blow. The mention of her father, the casual, brutal cruelty of it. It broke through the last of Annie's control. A hot, furious shame washed over her, so powerful it made her dizzy. She pushed off her stool, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She had to get out. She threw some crumpled bills on the bar and turned to leave, but Lori stepped in her way. Leaving so soon, the party's just getting started. Her friends were giggling behind her. The whole bar was watching now. Annie felt like an animal in a cage, surrounded by hungry eyes. All the pain and anger and humiliation of the last 10 years boiled up inside her. A sound, half sob, half growl, tore from her throat. She shoved past Lori, not caring about the other woman's surprised gasp. She burst out of the bar and into the cold night. She didn't run towards the pack houses. She ran away, towards the dark, tangled woods that marked the border. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. The trees became a black, blurry wall on either side of her as she ran blindly, stumbling over roots and rocks. The alcohol, the anger, the sorrow, it all churned inside her, a sickening cocktail of misery. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt like lead. She just wanted the pain to stop. The forest floor seemed to rush up to meet her. Her foot caught on something, and she fell, hard. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She lay there, on the damp earth, the scent of dirt and decaying leaves filling her senses. The world tilted and spun around her. The whiskey, the running, the emotional agony. It was all too much. Black spots danced in front of her eyes, growing bigger and bigger until they swallowed everything. Darkness closed in, a heavy, silent blanket. Her last coherent thought was a whisper of pure despair. It doesn't matter. Then nothing. Chapter 4. A Cage of Silk and Pine. Something was wrong. The world was too soft. Annie's first thought wasn't a thought at all, but a feeling. A deep, sinking comfort that didn't belong to her. She wasn't on the cold, damp forest floor anymore. No twigs dug into her back, no smell of wet dirt filled her nose. Instead, she was floating on a cloud that smelled like pine needles after a storm, like crisp winter air, and like him. A scent that was purely male, a mix of power and wildness that her body seemed to recognize on a level she couldn't understand. It was the scent of the alpha. Her eyes snapped open. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. She was in a bed. A massive bed with sheets so soft they felt like water against her skin. The room around her was huge, bigger than any room she'd ever been in. Dark wood walls rose to a high ceiling. Moonlight painted silver stripes across the floor through a gap in thick, heavy curtains. A fire crackled softly in a stone fireplace on the far wall, its light dancing over expensive furniture. This was a cage made of luxury, and she was the trapped animal. How did she get here? Why was she here? Then she saw him. He was standing by the window, a dark shape against the pale moonlight. Alpha Ethan. He wasn't looking at her, but she felt his attention on her like a physical weight. He was perfectly still, but the air around him vibrated with a tense, dangerous energy. It was like being in a room with a wolf that was trying very hard to pretend it wasn't a wolf. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings against a cage. This had to be a punishment. Maybe for running into the woods, for being a mess, for just being her. Because that's what her life was, a series of punishments for things she couldn't control. She pushed herself up, the silk sheets pooling around her waist. She was wearing a simple, soft t-shirt that was definitely not hers. It smelled of him. The intimate scent made her feel both invaded and strangely safe, a contradiction that made her head spin. What am I doing here? She asked, her voice a rough whisper. He turned his head slowly. In the dim light, his face was all shadows and sharp angles. His golden eyes seemed to glow. He didn't answer her question. He just watched her, his expression a mask of tight control. But underneath it, she could feel something wild, something desperate, fighting to get out. It was the same broken storm she had sensed in him earlier in the courtyard. What was he fighting so hard against? Why did looking at her seem to cause him so much pain? Was this some kind of sick game? He took a step forward, and the air crackled. The fire in the hearth flared for a second, casting his shadow long and monstrous against the wall. He opened his mouth to speak, but the voice that came out was not his. It wasn't the cold, clipped voice of the alpha. This was a sound from the dawn of time, a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into Annie's bones. It was the sound of the beast inside the man, and it spoke a single impossible word. Mate. The word wasn't just heard. It was felt. It slammed into her chest like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. A bolt of pure, white-hot energy shot through her veins. Deep inside her, in a place that had been silent and sleeping for 25 years, something woke up. Her own dormant wolf stirred, stretching its limbs for the very first time, answering a call it had waited its whole life to hear. It was a moment of shocking, terrifying clarity. Everything, the loneliness, the feeling of being an outcast, the sense that she was missing a piece of herself, it all made sense. This was the piece, this man, this impossible, cruel man. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Shock, fear, and a pull so strong it felt like gravity was tilting the room, drawing her towards him. This couldn't be happening. Not him. Anyone but him. But just as this new, terrifying reality began to settle, the look on Ethan's face shattered it. The possessive light in his eyes vanished, replaced by pure, undiluted horror. He looked at her as if she were a disease, a poison he had just accidentally swallowed. The beast's rumble was gone. Now, in his own cold, human voice, he snarled the words that would become the new bars of her cage. You. Don't. Belong. Here. Chapter 5. The Cruelty of Fate. One word had built a universe. Mate. It was a word of belonging, of destiny, of coming home. It still echoed in Annie's soul, a beautiful, fragile song. And then, with 5 other words, he had burned that new universe to the ground. You don't belong here. It was the story of her life, the sentence she had been serving since she was a child, now spoken by the one person who was supposed to be her sanctuary. The whiplash was so violent it almost made her sick. The pain came next. A sharp, tearing agony in her chest as the mate bond, newly formed and screaming with joy, was violently rejected. It was a cruelty so deep, so personal, it went beyond anything Lori or the others had ever done. Because this wasn't just an insult, this was a denial of her very soul. But buried under all that pain was a hard, stubborn core of anger. She had been pushed around, whispered about, and ignored her entire life. She would not fall apart now. Not for him. Get out, he bit out, his voice rough. He wouldn't look at her, staring instead at a spot on the wall as if seeing her would physically burn him. Her pride, the only thing she truly had left, rose up like a shield. You think I want this? She shot back, her voice shaking but laced with fury. She swung her legs out of the bed, grabbing the silk sheet and pulling it around herself like a cheap robe. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but she would die before she let him see it. To be tied to you? A cold, arrogant tyrant who rules a pack of bullies? You think this is some kind of prize? Every word was a stone she threw at his perfect, controlled mask. He flinched. For a second, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Hurt. The bond was a two-way street. He felt it too. Good. The knowledge gave her a bitter sliver of strength. She took a step towards him, her bare feet silent on the plush rug. So go ahead. Reject me. Do it. Because I reject you right back, Alpha. The title dripped from her tongue, heavy with sarcasm and scorn. I don't want a mate, and I especially don't want you. The moment the words left her mouth, a fresh wave of pain slammed into both of them. It was 1,000 times worse than the first. It felt like her soul was being ripped in half. She gasped, stumbling back, clutching her chest. Across the room, Ethan let out a choked sound, his hand flying to his own chest. He staggered, leaning against a bookshelf for support. This was the bond. It connected them, for better or for worse. To deny it was to try and tear flesh from bone. It was an agony that defied description, because it was a pain that existed beyond the physical body. His control, stretched so thin already, finally snapped. A low, warning growl ripped from his throat, no longer a word, just pure animal sound. He pushed himself off the bookshelf, and the man was gone. The thing that looked at her now was the beast. His golden eyes began to glow with an inner fire, the pupils elongating into slits. The air grew heavy, thick with a raw, untamed power that made her want to run and submit all at once. He took a step towards her, his body seeming to shift and swell, his muscles bunching under his skin. His fingers twitched, and for a terrifying second, his nails thickened, darkening into wicked, curved claws. He was losing himself. The storm she had sensed inside him was breaking free, and it was aimed directly at her. Fear, cold and absolute, finally cut through her anger. He was going to shift. Right here. He was going to lose control, and he might kill her. Was this the curse she had seen in his eyes? A wolf that couldn't be controlled? He lunged forward, not to attack, but just to close the distance between them. It was a move of pure instinct, of a predator needing to be near its mate. He reached for her, that monstrous hand with its new claws coming towards her face. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. But it never came. Instead, she felt a feather-light touch against the skin of her arm. A searing, stinging line of fire. She opened her eyes. He had stopped, his hand hovering in the air. His claws had grazed her arm, leaving 3 thin, parallel lines of red beading on her skin. The sight of her blood seemed to douse the fire in his eyes. The golden glow faded. The claws retracted. He stared at his own hand, then at the blood on her arm, and a look of pure self-loathing washed over his face. He recoiled as if he'd been burned, stumbling back until his legs hit the chair behind him and he collapsed into it. He looked broken. A king defeated not by an enemy, but by himself. Chapter 6. A Poisoned Kindness. The silence in the room was a living thing. It was filled with the ragged sound of their breathing and the throbbing, painful hum of the wounded bond between them. Annie stared at the thin lines of blood on her arm. It didn't hurt much, but seeing it there, seeing what he had almost done, made her feel cold all over. Ethan sat collapsed in the chair, his head in his hands. He looked like a man staring into an abyss. The powerful alpha was gone, replaced by someone lost and horrified. For a strange, confusing moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Then a soft, polite knock echoed from the heavy wooden door. The sound made both of them jump. Ethan's head snapped up, his face instantly reverting to that cold, unreadable mask. But his eyes were haunted. "Enter," he commanded, his voice rough. The door opened and Lori stepped inside, a picture of calm and grace. She was dressed in a soft, cream-colored sweater, looking warm and approachable. She took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, Annie clutching a sheet, her arm bleeding, the alpha looking like he'd just survived a war. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows rose in a look of delicate concern. "Alpha, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice smooth as silk. She walked further into the room, her eyes landing on Annie. Her expression softened into one of deep sympathy. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, rushing to Annie's side. She gently took Annie's arm, her touch surprisingly soft. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She made a little sound of distress as she saw the scratches. Annie was so confused and emotionally exhausted that she didn't pull away. She was in shock, and Lori's kindness felt like the only solid thing in a world that had just been turned upside down. Lori shot a look over her shoulder at Ethan. It wasn't an angry look, it was worse. It was a look of profound disappointment, the kind a mother might give a child who had done something terribly wrong. "Ethan, what have you done?" she whispered, just loud enough for Annie to hear. Ethan stood up, his face pale. "Lori, this is not your concern." "Not my concern?" She turned back to Annie, pulling the sheet more securely around her shoulders. This young woman is hurt and terrified in your chambers. Of course it's my concern." She was playing a part, and she was playing it perfectly. The part of the protector. The savior. She turned back to Annie, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Come with me, honey. Let's get you out of here. I have some clothes you can wear. We'll get you cleaned up." Annie just nodded, numb. She wanted to leave. She wanted to run from this room, from this man, from this impossible, painful bond. Lori was offering her an escape, and she was too weak to refuse it. Because accepting help, even from someone she instinctively disliked, was easier than standing here and facing the man who was her fated mate and her sworn tormentor. Lori wrapped a supportive arm around Annie's shoulders and began to lead her towards the door. As they walked, she leaned in close, her breath warm against Annie's ear. "Don't mind him," she murmured. "The alpha, he's under a lot of pressure. He's not himself sometimes." She paused, then added with a heavy dose of meaning, "It's probably for the best that you stay far away from him, for your own safety." It sounded like a warning. It sounded like kindness. Annie couldn't tell the difference anymore. At the door, Annie couldn't stop herself from looking back one last time. Ethan was still standing in the middle of the vast, empty room. The firelight flickered across his face, making the shadows dance. He wasn't looking at them. His head was tilted back, his eyes closed, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped. He didn't look like a king on his throne. He looked like a prisoner on a rack. She couldn't hear a sound, but she felt it. A tremor through the bond, a vibration of pure, silent agony. It was the howl of a wolf that had just chewed off its own leg to escape a trap, only to find it was still tethered by a chain made of its own soul. The door clicked shut behind her, cutting him off. Annie was now alone in the hallway with Lori, the woman's arm a heavy, proprietary weight on her shoulders. She had escaped the cage of silk and pine, only to walk straight into another one, cleverly disguised as an act of kindness. She just didn't know it yet. Chapter 7. The sleeping beast stirs normal. Annie clung to the word like a shipwreck survivor to a piece of driftwood. For 2 days, she had tried to stitch the torn fabric of her life back together. She went back to her menial jobs. She scrubbed the same stubborn floors and folded endless piles of laundry. She kept her head down and her mouth shut. She tried to pretend that she had never woken up in a room that smelled of pine and power. She tried to convince herself that the word mate was just a nightmare, a cruel trick played by a mind pushed to its breaking point. But it was a lie, a flimsy, useless lie. Something had changed inside her. It was a low, constant hum of energy beneath her skin, a current of electricity she'd never felt before. The world was different now, brighter, louder. The bond to Ethan was a dull, persistent ache in her chest, a phantom limb that connected her to a man she desperately wanted to forget. Sometimes when she was alone in her small, drab room, she would catch a phantom scent on the air, pine and winter, and her heart would do a stupid, painful flip. He was nowhere near, but the bond didn't care about distance. It was a change she couldn't see, but one she felt with every breath. Lori's kindness had become a suffocating blanket. She checked on Annie constantly, bringing her food, asking if she was all right. Her eyes were always filled with a sweet, syrupy concern that made Annie's skin crawl. "You just need to rest and stay away from stressful situations," she'd said, her meaning as clear as glass. "Stay away from the alpha." It was a warning disguised as care, and Annie was too tired to fight it. She just nodded and accepted the poisoned kindness, because it was easier than the alternative. Today, she was hauling a large wicker basket of clean linens from the laundry house to the main hall. The sun was bright, the air was cool, and the work was mindless. Normal. She focused on the rough texture of the wicker against her fingers, the clean, soapy smell of the sheets. But then it happened. As she crossed the edge of the courtyard, the world exploded. Her senses, usually so dull and human, flared to life with an intensity that made her stagger. Suddenly, she could smell the rosemary and thyme being chopped in the kitchen 100 yards away. She could hear the quiet, bored conversation of 2 guards standing watch on the western wall, their words as clear as if they were standing next to her. A bird took flight from a tree, and she felt the whoosh of its wings in the air like a physical touch. The heavy basket in her arms, which should have been making her muscles burn, felt as light as a handful of feathers. It was too much. It was overwhelming. A tidal wave of information flooding a mind built to handle a gentle stream. What was happening to me? She dropped the basket. The clean linen spilled out onto the dusty ground. She barely noticed. A surge of raw, unfamiliar power was rocketing through her body. It was a wild, feral energy that felt ancient and new all at once. For one dizzying, terrifying second, she felt the ghost of another body inside her own. She felt the powerful muscles of a wolf's legs, coiled and ready to run. She felt the phantom sensation of a muzzle, the instinct to lift her head and taste the wind. It was her wolf. The sleeping, silent thing she thought she didn't have. It was awake. And it was strong. Panic seized her. This was wrong. She wasn't supposed to have this power, this wildness. It didn't belong to the trader's daughter. She shoved the feeling down, fighting it with every bit of her will. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the world to go dim again. No. Go away. Stop. She was shaking, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This power was tied to him, to the bond. It was a part of him, now living inside her, and it terrified her. Annie, are you all right? The voice was Laurie's. Annie's eyes snapped open. The beta stood a few feet away, a perfectly sculpted picture of concern. But Annie had seen her a second before she spoke. For just a fraction of a moment, Laurie's friendly mask had slipped. In its place was a look of sharp, calculating assessment. Her eyes had been narrowed, focused on Annie with a chilling intensity. She had seen it. She had seen the flicker of gold in Annie's eyes, the moment the power had surged through her. And in that unguarded second, Annie knew one thing for sure. Laurie wasn't just concerned, she was watching, and she knew exactly what this new power meant. Chapter 8. A Savage Protection. The great hall buzzed with a nervous energy that scraped against Annie's newly sharpened senses. It was a nightmare. 100 different scents, food, sweat, perfume, dust, crashed together in a wave that made her feel dizzy. A dozen conversations overlapped into a meaningless roar in her ears. She felt like she was standing at the bottom of an ocean of noise. Laurie had insisted she come. A rival alpha, a man named Kale from the Jagged Stonefall Pack, was visiting to discuss territory lines. It's important for the pack to see you're okay, Laurie had urged, her smile bright and fake, to show everyone that things are back to normal. But nothing was normal, and Annie felt less like a pack member and more like a lamb being led to slaughter. She tried to make herself small, hiding in a corner near a large, unlit fireplace, nursing a cup of water she didn't want. She just needed to survive the night. But trouble, it seemed, had a way of sniffing her out. A large shadow fell over her, blocking the light from the chandeliers. The air filled with the rank, earthy smell of damp soil and unbridled aggression. Well now, what do we have here? The voice was a low, gravelly rumble. Annie looked up into the face of Alpha Kale. He was a mountain of a man, with a thick black beard and small, clever eyes that roamed over her with an unsettling hunger. He was the kind of man who took what he wanted simply because he could. I don't think we've met, he said, his lips curling into a smirk that wasn't friendly. I'm Alpha Kale. Annie, she mumbled, wanting to shrink into the stone wall behind her. He leaned in closer, sniffing the air near her neck. A shiver of pure disgust ran down her spine. Annie, he repeated, savoring the name. You have a unique scent, unclaimed, but with a hint of something powerful. Wasted here, scrubbing floors, I hear. His eyes flickered with a cruel amusement. Daughter of the great trader. It's a shame. In my pack, We find a use for everyone. Once they learn their place, of course. His meaning was clear. He saw her as a thing, an interesting, unclaimed thing to be broken and used. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers wrapping around her bicep like a band of iron. It was the same arm Ethan had scratched. His touch was rough, possessive. "Let go of me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Cale just laughed. "Feisty. I like that." He tightened his grip, pulling her slightly off balance. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Annie's veins. That wild, untamed energy inside her surged to the surface, a defensive instinct she couldn't control. A low warning sound, too deep to be human, started to build in her throat. She was going to fight. She didn't care if he was an alpha. She was going to claw his eyes out. She never got the chance. One moment, Cale was sneering down at her. The next, a blur of black motion exploded across the hall. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Alpha Ethan, who had been standing across the room talking to his betas, was suddenly there. He moved with an impossible, supernatural speed, a predator unleashed. Before Cale could even react, Ethan had him by the throat, slamming him back against the stone wall with a crack that echoed through the now deadly silent hall. Ethan's face was transformed. The cold mask was gone, replaced by the face of a primal god of fury. His eyes were not gold. They were blazing suns of pure, undiluted rage. A growl ripped from his chest, a terrifying, guttural sound that was less a warning and more a promise of death. His forearm pressed tighter against Cale's throat, lifting the bigger man's feet clean off the floor. Then he spoke. One word. A word of absolute, undeniable, and savage possession. Mine, the word wasn't for her. It wasn't a confession of love. It was a brand. A claim staked in front of his pack, his rivals, and the entire world. It was a declaration that to touch her was to touch him, and to touch him was to die. Annie stared, frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified. She was humiliated. And deep down, in the new, wild part of her soul that was just waking up, she was thrilled. She felt protected, cared for, claimed. It was a poisonously seductive feeling. Ethan held Kyle for a moment longer, letting the threat sink in, before dropping him in a heap on the floor. Kyle gasped for air, his face pale with a mixture of rage and genuine fear. Ethan didn't even give him a second glance. His burning gaze found Annie's. The fire was still there, but now, underneath it, she saw the tormented man again. The man who was a slave to the very bond he had tried to deny. From the edge of the room, Lori watched. Her face was a perfect, beautiful mask of calm, but her eyes were chips of ice, filled with a cold, silent fury. He had just undone all her careful work in a single, possessive snarl. Chapter 9. The Unclaimed Kiss. The great hall was still buzzing, thick with whispers and shocked glances. Annie felt like she was under a microscope, every eye in the room dissecting her, trying to figure out how the pack's ghost had suddenly become the alpha's obsession. She couldn't stand it. She slipped out through a side door, finding refuge on a small stone balcony that overlooked the dark, sleeping forest. The cool night air was a relief against her hot skin. She leaned against the cold stone railing, trying to make sense of the hurricane of emotions inside her. Anger, fear, confusion, and a tiny, treacherous spark of something that felt dangerously like hope. Footsteps on the stone behind her made her stiffen. She didn't have to turn around. She could feel his presence. She could smell the familiar, intoxicating scent of pine, and the storm that was uniquely him. "Are you all right?" Ethan's voice was low, stripped of the alpha's authority. It was just the voice of a man, a haunted man. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice tight. She refused to look at him. "In front of everyone. You claim me after you threw me away. What kind of cruel game is this?" "It wasn't a game," he said, moving to stand beside her at the railing, though he kept a careful distance between them. I saw him touch you, and my wolf, it took over. I couldn't stop it. It was a confession, an admission of weakness from a man who was supposed to be all-powerful. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "So you're a slave to your wolf?" She shot back, though her anger was starting to fade, replaced by a weary curiosity. "You can't control it? With this? With you?" He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "No, it seems I can't." He finally looked at her, and in the pale moonlight, she could see the exhaustion etched on his face. "Rejecting you was a mistake. I know that now. I was afraid. I still am." "Afraid of what?" she whispered. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently touched the sleeve over her arm. The arm Cale had grabbed. The arm he himself had scratched. "Of this," he said, his voice ragged with a pain that felt ancient. "Of hurting you. Of what's inside me." He looked down at his own hand as if it were a weapon. "I'm not whole, Annie. My wolf is fractured, damaged. It's why my control is so thin. It's a curse." His vulnerability was a crack in her defenses. All the anger, all the hurt, it all just melted away, leaving only the raw, undeniable pull of the bond. Without thinking, she covered his hand with her own. "You're not a monster, Ethan." The contact was like lightning striking a dry forest. A gasp was torn from both of them. He turned, closing the distance between them in an instant. His other hand came up, tangling in her hair, tilting her head back. His golden eyes were dark with a desperate, hungry fire. This wasn't the cold alpha or the raging beast. This was the man, torn apart by longing. "Annie." He breathed her name like a prayer and a curse. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their first kiss wasn't sweet or gentle. It was a desperate, frantic collision of two souls who had been fighting a war against their own nature. It was the taste of pine and sorrow and a desperate, burning need. It was a kiss that said, "I shouldn't, but I can't stop." He pushed her back against the cold stone of the balcony wall, his body a warm, hard cage around hers. His mouth was hungry, demanding, and she answered with a ferocity that surprised them both. This was what she had been missing. This was the other half of the song in her soul. His lips left hers, trailing a line of fire down her jaw, to the sensitive skin of her neck. His teeth grazed the spot just above her collarbone, the place where a mate's mark belonged. A shudder went through her. Her head fell back, a silent invitation, a plea. "Mark me. Claim me. Make this real." The part of her that was wolf was howling for it, for the final, sealing bite that would make them one. She felt him tense. A deep, shuddering groan was torn from his chest, a sound of pure agony. And then he pulled back. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing harsh and broken. She could feel the tremors running through his powerful body. He was fighting the battle of his life. "I can't," he rasped, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I can't. Not like this. Not until I know I won't hurt you. Not until I can control the beast." Before she could say anything, before she could tell him she wasn't afraid, he was gone. He turned and vanished back into the shadows of the hall, leaving her breathless, aching and trembling against the cold stone. The bond between them was no longer a dull ache. It was a screaming, vibrant thing, alive with a desire that had been acknowledged, tasted, and then cruelly denied. She was more alone now than she had ever been before. And somewhere in the darkness of the keep, Lori was watching, and she knew that gentle manipulation was no longer enough. It was time to sharpen her claws. Chapter 10. The Fractured Wolf. The morning sun felt like an accusation. It streamed through the small window of Annie's room, bright and cheerful, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside her. The memory of Ethan's kiss, of his desperate retreat, was a brand on her skin. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his lips, the raw hunger in his touch. The pack was a hive of whispers. Everyone had seen the alpha's savage display of possession. They had all seen him follow her out onto the balcony. Now, when she walked through the corridors, the pack members didn't just ignore her. They stared. Their eyes were filled with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and contempt. She had gone from being the pack ghost to the pack scandal. She escaped to the one place she knew she would be alone, the old pack library. It was a dusty, forgotten room filled with the scent of aging paper and leather. Most wolves preferred to learn through instinct and action, not words on a page. She ran her fingers over the spines of ancient books, the quiet of the room a balm on her frayed nerves. She needed to think, to understand the man who could kiss her like he was dying of thirst and then pull away as if she were poison. "I thought I might find you here." His voice was quiet, but it filled the silent room. Ethan stood in the doorway, looking even more haunted than he had the night before. Dark circles shadowed his golden eyes, and his shoulders were slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with being an alpha. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, a man at war with himself. Annie's heart did a painful little jump. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to demand why he had left her aching and confused. Another part, a softer, more foolish part, just wanted to go to him and smooth the worry from his brow. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice coming out colder than she intended. "To explain," he said simply, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. He walked over to the large oak table in the center of the room, but didn't sit. He just rested his hands on the worn wood. "You deserve to know why I pulled away, why I can't be the mate you deserve." She finally turned to face him, crossing her arms over her chest. A shield. "You said your wolf was fractured. What does that mean?" He took a deep, shaky breath, and the story came tumbling out. It was a story of fire and blood and dark magic. Years ago, when he was just a teenager, his father, the alpha at the time, had been challenged by a powerful rogue wolf. This wasn't a normal challenge for dominance. The rogue used forbidden magic, dark spells that twisted the laws of nature. Ethan's father had died, but not before striking a mortal blow to his attacker. Ethan, trying to defend his pack, had been caught in the backlash of the dying rogue's curse. The magic had latched onto him, seeking to corrupt the next in the alpha line. It didn't kill him. It did something worse. "It didn't break my body," Ethan explained, his voice low and raw with the memory. "It broke my wolf. It put a crack in the connection between man and beast. Most of the time, I can control it. I have to be cold, distant, in command of every emotion. Because if I'm not," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "What happens if you're not?" Annie prompted, her anger forgotten, replaced now by a dawning horror. "The beast takes over," he whispered, his golden eyes filled with a terrifying emptiness. "But it's not my wolf, not really. It's a mindless savage thing, driven only by the curse. When my emotions run too high, rage, fear, extreme possessiveness, the kind of emotions a true mating would unleash, I lose control. Completely. The last time it happened, I nearly killed my own beta for a simple training infraction. I woke up with his blood on my hands and no memory of how it got there." He finally looked at her, his gaze filled with a desperate plea for her to understand. "In the heat of a mating, with the instinct so high, I would kill you, Annie. I would lose myself to the beast, and I would destroy the one thing it wants most." The truth of his words settled over her, heavy and cold. This was his cage, not the alpha title, but this curse. He wasn't a cold, arrogant tyrant. He was a prisoner, living in constant terror of the monster that lived inside him. All his coldness, his distance, it was all a shield. Not to protect himself, but to protect everyone else from him. Her heart, which had been so full of anger, now just ached with a profound, painful empathy. She walked towards him, her arms uncrossing. She stopped in front of him, and without a word, reached up and gently touched his face, her thumb stroking the rough stubble on his cheek. "You've been all alone with this," she whispered. It wasn't a question. He let out a shuddering breath and leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a brief second. It was a gesture of complete and total surrender. For that one moment, he wasn't an alpha. He was just a man, finally sharing a burden he had carried alone for far too long. A fragile, terrifying hope began to bloom in the space between them. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this together. Chapter 11. The Public Betrayal. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. For 3 days, Annie nurtured it like a secret flame in her heart. Ethan's confession had changed everything. They weren't enemies anymore. They were two people bound by a powerful, complicated fate, facing a terrible obstacle. They had started meeting in secret, in the dusty library or in the dead of night by the edge of the woods. They didn't kiss again. It was too risky. But they talked. For the first time in her life, Annie felt like someone was truly seeing her. And she was seeing him, the man behind the alpha mask. The hope grew, warm and bright, chasing away some of the shadows that had followed her for so long. Then the summons came. A formal pack assembly was called for that evening. A thrill of fear and anticipation shot through Annie. The whole pack was buzzing. Everyone knew what this had to be about. The alpha was going to address the situation. He was going to make an announcement about the traitor's daughter, the one he had so publicly and savagely claimed. When one of the alpha's personal guards came to escort her to the Great Hall, her heart pounded with a nervous rhythm. This was it. She was led not to the back of the hall where she usually lurked, but to the front, near the raised platform where the alpha stood to address his pack. Lori was already there, standing to Ethan's left, looking serene and beautiful in a deep blue dress. She gave Annie a small, unreadable smile. Annie stood on the other side, her hands trembling. She felt the eyes of the entire pack on her, a heavy weight of judgment and curiosity. She looked at Ethan. He stood tall and proud, dressed in the formal black leather of his office. He looked every bit the powerful leader. But when his eyes met hers across the platform, she saw the same conflict, the same torment. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. Trust me. She held on to that look, that silent promise. The hall fell silent as Ethan raised his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was strong and clear, amplified by the hall's acoustics. He spoke of the pack's strength, of their future, of the challenges they faced from rivals like Kale. He spoke of the need for unity, for stability. An alpha is only as strong as the pack behind him, he declared, his voice ringing with authority. And a pack is only as strong as the family at its heart. For too long, this pack has been without its Luna. A murmur went through the crowd. Annie's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Her gaze was locked on Ethan, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. He was going to choose her. He was going to defy the curse, defy the pack's prejudice, and choose his fated mate. The hope inside her burned so brightly it almost hurt. Ethan's gaze swept over the crowd, finally landing on her. For one agonizing second, his mask of control cracked, and she saw a flash of raw, desperate apology in his eyes. A look of pure agony. Then, it was gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall. A tiny sliver of ice pierced the warmth of her hope. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, away from her. He looked at the beautiful, confident she-wolf standing beside him. He looked at Lori. To ensure the continued strength and stability of the Silver Moon Pack, Ethan announced, his voice booming through the hall. I have made my choice. I will be taking Lori as my chosen mate and future Luna. The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, meaningless vibrations in the air. Then, they slammed into her, a physical blow that knocked the breath from her body and shattered the fragile world she had just started to build. The hall erupted. Cheers from Lori's supporters, shocked gasps from others. Lori stepped forward, placing a delicate hand on Ethan's arm. She looked over at Annie, her face a perfect, sorrowful mask of sympathy. It was the most triumphant look Annie had ever seen. Betrayal. The feeling was cold and absolute. It was a blade of ice sliding between her ribs, straight into her heart. His confession, their secret talks, that look in his eyes that had promised her everything. It was all a lie, a sick, cruel lie. He had drawn her in, made her feel safe, made her hope. And then, he had done this. He had stood her in front of the entire pack and publicly, brutally, cast her aside for another woman, for her. The humiliation was a fire, burning away the hurt, burning away the sorrow, leaving behind only a cold, hard, diamond-sharp rage. She didn't cry. She didn't scream or run. She stood tall, lifted her chin, and met Ethan's tormented gaze with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. Her own heart was a frozen rock in her chest. He had made his choice to protect her, to protect his pack. Fine. Now she would make hers. "You will not be the one to break me," she thought, the words a silent vow. "I will break this bond myself. I will be the one to walk away." Chapter 12. A Bond of Ash. The forest was a blur of black and gray. Annie ran, fueled by a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice in her veins. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from the Great Hall, away from the sounds of celebration that were a monument to her humiliation. The pain from the bond was a living thing, a screaming, clawing beast inside her chest. It wasn't the dull ache of before. This was the agony of betrayal, sharp and relentless, feeding on Ethan's choice, on Laurie's triumphant smile. Each beat of her heart was a fresh wave of torment. She finally collapsed in a small clearing, the same one where she had fallen on her birthday. It felt like a lifetime ago. The full moon was high in the sky, a cold, indifferent witness hanging in a sea of black. This was where her nightmare had truly begun. It seemed fitting that this was where it would end. She knew what she had to do. The knowledge was old, instinctual, a piece of lore passed down through generations of wolves, a formal rejection, a ritual of soul-tearing finality. It was dangerous. Some said it was a curse in itself. A rejection spoken under the full moon could shatter a wolf's spirit, leaving them a hollow shell. In rare cases, the shock could even kill them. Good. Let it. She got to her feet, her body trembling not with fear but with a terrible, resolute power. He thought he could protect her by casting her aside like garbage. He thought he could break her heart and still keep her tethered to his soul. No. She was taking back control. This would not be his decision. This would be hers. If their bond was a chain, she would be the one to break it. She would chew off her own foot to get out of his trap. This was not an act of heartbreak. This was an act of war. She stood in the center of the clearing, the moonlight bathing her in a ghostly silver light. She closed her eyes, dredging up the ancient words from some deep, forgotten part of her mind. The part of her that was Wolf. The part he had woken up and then betrayed. She took a deep, shuddering breath and spoke, her voice clear and strong in the silent woods. "I, Annie of the Silver Moon Pack, daughter of Marcus, do hereby sever this tie." The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The wind died. The forest held its breath. "I reject you, Alpha Ethan, as my mate," she cried out, her voice rising with every ounce of pain and fury she possessed. She threw her head back and screamed the final, world-ending words at the silent, watching moon. "Let the bond turn to ash and the call be silenced forever." The world exploded. It was not a sound. It was a feeling. A cataclysmic, soul-shattering rip. The pain was absolute. It was a supernova of agony detonating in her chest, a force so powerful it threw her from her feet. She hit the ground, hard, a scream tearing from her throat. It felt like her spirit was being physically torn from her body, shredded into a million pieces. This was a pain beyond pain, a death of a part of herself she had only just discovered. And through the screaming agony, through the violent severing of their connection, she felt him. She felt an echo of his pain, and it was a million times worse than her own. She felt the moment the rejection hit him, a metaphysical tidal wave crashing into his soul. She felt his wolf, the fractured, damaged beast he kept so carefully caged, scream in denial. And then, under the brutal, unforgiving force of her rejection, she felt it shatter. Not break. Shatter. The crack in his soul became a gaping, bottomless chasm. The beast was broken. The man was alone. The pain finally, mercifully began to recede. It drained away, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. The space in her chest where the bond had lived was now a void, a dead, silent place. She was free. The chain was broken. She lay on the ground, gasping, sweat and tears mingling on her face. It was over. Then a new sound drifted through the trees from the direction of the pack house. It was a sound that made the blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't the howl of a wolf. It wasn't the scream of a man. It was a horrifying, unnatural sound that was both and neither. A long, drawn-out cry of pure, mindless, unending agony. A howl that was broken. A howl that was insane. It didn't stop. It just went on, tearing through the night. A new, chilling horror washed over her, colder and more terrifying than any pain. What have I done? She thought, the words a silent, panicked whisper in the dark. Did I just destroy him completely? Chapter 13. The Scent of Blood. The silence was louder than the howling had been. For days, an unnerving quiet had fallen over the packlands, emanating from the Alpha's private wing like a plague. The agonizing cries that had torn through the night of Annie's rejection had stopped, but the void they left behind was somehow worse. It was the silence of a tomb. The pack felt it too. They moved with a nervous, twitchy energy, their eyes constantly darting towards the Alpha's silent windows. Lori had taken charge, her voice a little too sharp, her smiles a little too bright. She was a queen ruling over a kingdom whose king was dead or dying, and her grip on the throne felt fragile. Annie moved through this tense new world like a ghost. The gaping hole in her chest where the bond used to be was a constant, cold companion. It didn't scream anymore. It just ached. A dull, empty ache for something she had destroyed. The guilt was a heavy cloak she couldn't take off. Had she killed him? Had her desperate act of defiance broken him beyond repair? The questions haunted her, following her into her thin, restless sleep. She was scrubbing pots in the kitchen, a punishment for her public scene with Cale disguised as a necessary chore, when Lori found her. "Annie," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I need you to run a delivery of medicinal herbs to the Northern Border Patrol. They're running low." It was a strange request. It was a long walk, and a job usually given to a pack warrior, not the outcast. But Annie just nodded. Anything to get away from the oppressive quiet of the keep. Anything to stop thinking. The forest was cool and dark, the path dappled with sunlight. But as she neared the border, the air grew still. Too still. The birds had gone silent. The rustle of small animals had ceased. A prickle of unease crawled up her spine. That new, half-awake part of her, the sluggish wolf within, sensed danger. She clutched the basket of herbs tighter and quickened her pace. She never made it. They stepped out from behind the trees, surrounding her in a half-circle. It was Alpha Cale, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. With him were 3 of his largest, meanest-looking warriors. "Look what we have here," Cale rumbled, his small eyes glinting. "The little lost wolf. All alone." "What do you want?" Annie asked, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "I heard a story," he said, taking a slow step towards her. "About an alpha who chose another, and a fated mate who screamed his rejection to the moon. I hear your great alpha hasn't been seen since, that he just broke." He chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "I decided to come and collect the prize he was too weak to keep." He lunged, and she dodged, dropping her basket. The herbs scattered across the forest floor. She tried to fight, The wildness she had felt before was still there, a flicker of feral rage, but without the bond to fuel it, it was like a fire with no air. She was fast, but they were stronger. Two of the warriors grabbed her arms, their grips like iron, holding her still. Kyle sauntered towards her, his gaze lingering on the curve of her neck. "Don't worry," he sneered. "I'll take good care of you. Once I mark you as mine, your old pack won't be able to do a thing. Ethan's final humiliation, his fated mate bearing my bite." Tears of rage and terror stung her eyes. No, not this, anything but this. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by a roar. It wasn't a sound she had ever heard before. It was a sound from the deepest pits of hell. A roar of pure, unadulterated, mindless fury. It ripped through the forest, shaking the very leaves on the trees. From the shadows, a shape exploded into the clearing. It was Ethan, but it wasn't. His eyes were glowing gold, but there was no thought, no reason behind them, only the curse. He was caught somewhere between man and wolf, a horrifying parody of a shift. His muscles were bunched and distorted, his face elongated, his teeth sharpened into fangs. This was the fractured beast, the mindless monster he had warned her about. He didn't move with a warrior's skill. He moved with the suicidal, savage rage of a cornered animal, launching himself at Cale's men. Annie could only watch in horror. He was a whirlwind of claws and teeth, a storm of broken fury. He took wounds that should have crippled him and didn't seem to notice, his only focus to tear apart anything that stood between him and her. She saw it then. Even in this mindless state, every savage, uncontrolled lunge was designed to do one thing: protect her. He was a living shield of pain and rage. He would die here, torn to shreds, before he let them lay another hand on her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The bond was gone. But his love, his instinct to protect her, was not. He dispatched the warriors with a brutal, terrifying efficiency, then turned on a pale-faced Cale. He slammed the rival alpha into a tree, a guttural stream of warnings ripping from his throat. He left Cale alive but broken and bleeding before the rage finally seemed to burn itself out. The golden light in his eyes faded. The monstrous tension in his body eased. And then, like a puppet with its strings cut, he collapsed to the forest floor, his body a canvas of deep, bleeding wounds. The beast was gone. The broken man was all that was left. Chapter 14. A trail of lies panic was a wild, frantic bird in Annie's chest. She rushed to Ethan's side, her hands hovering over the terrible wounds that covered his body. He had fought like a berserker, with no thought for his own safety. Blood matted his dark hair and soaked his torn shirt. He was breathing, but it was shallow and ragged. She had to do something. She couldn't leave him here to die. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to get one of his arms over her shoulders and half drag, half carry him away from the clearing, away from the scene of the carnage. She remembered a place from her childhood, a small, abandoned hunter's cabin hidden deep in a part of the forest no one ever went to anymore. It was their only chance. The journey was a blur of pain and desperation. He was so heavy, a dead weight against her, and by the time she stumbled through the cabin's rickety door, she was exhausted, her muscles screaming in protest. She eased him onto a dusty, moth-eaten cot, his head lolling to the side. He was unconscious, lost to the world. The cabin was small and dark, smelling of dust and old memories. There was a rusty hand pump for water and a few old rags that would have to serve as bandages. Her hands trembled as she began to clean his wounds. Seeing him like this, so broken and vulnerable, was a special kind of torture. It was a stark reminder of what her rejection had done to him, what his own curse had cost him. The hollow place in her chest ached with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. This was her fault. All of it. As she gently cleaned a deep gash on his side, her fingers brushed against the damp fabric of his shirt. A strange, bitter scent rose from the cloth, hiding underneath the coppery smell of blood. She paused, sniffing again. It was an herbal smell. Unpleasant. Familiar. She had smelled it before in the kitchens, in the section where the pack healers kept their more dangerous plants. It was wolfsbane. But it was faint, a diluted version of the poison. It wasn't strong enough to kill a wolf, especially not an alpha, but she remembered the healers talking about it. A weak, steady dose. It wouldn't kill. It would just weaken. It would cloud the mind, suppress a wolf's natural healing, and fray the delicate connection between the man and his beast. A cold dread, sharp and ugly, began to creep up her spine. How? How did wolfsbane get on him? Her mind started to race, tumbling over the events of the past few weeks, seeing them now in a new, sinister light. Lori, always there, always managing him. Lori, with her constant, cloying concern. Lori, who had told Annie he was not himself sometimes. Annie's mind flashed back to a memory from a week ago. She had been passing the Alpha's private kitchen and had seen Lori inside, preparing a tray. On it was a cup of steaming tea, the same bitter, herbal scent wafting from it. Lori had said it was a special calming blend, just for the Alpha's stress. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture so monstrous it made her feel sick. His curse, the fracture in his soul, it was real. But Lori had been exploiting it. She had been feeding him a slow, steady poison, making the curse worse. She was deliberately weakening his control, making him more volatile, more dependent on her to manage his episodes. She had been driving him mad, slowly and methodically, to secure her own position of power. She hadn't been helping him. She had been cementing her control over him, ensuring he would never be strong enough to resist her influence. The public rejection, the choice that had shattered Annie's world. It wasn't a cold, calculated betrayal. It was the desperate, terrified act of a man who was being systematically broken down, a man who truly believed he was a monster. He had pushed Annie away and chosen Lori because he thought he was putting her in safe hands. He thought he was saving her from himself, when all along, he was delivering her to the snake who held the poison. The guilt that had been crushing Annie transformed in an instant. It burned away, leaving behind a hard, cold fury. She hadn't been betrayed by Ethan. She had been played. They both had in the cruelest way imaginable. Lori hadn't just stolen her mate. She had stolen his sanity. She had built her throne on a foundation of lies and poison. A low groan came from the cot. Ethan's eyelids fluttered open. His golden eyes, cloudy with pain, struggled to focus. They found her, and a flicker of recognition, of relief, passed through them. His lips moved, forming a single broken word. Annie. In that moment, everything became clear. Her fight was not with the man lying broken on the cot. Her fight was with the woman who had put him there, and it was a fight she would not lose. Chapter 15. The First Night. They were trapped. Ethan was awake but weak, his powerful body struggling against the lingering effects of the wolfsbane and the deep wounds he had sustained. His healing, normally so rapid, was sluggish and slow. They were fugitives in their own territory, hiding in a dusty cabin while a viper sat on the throne. The small enclosed space was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of their broken bond and shattered hearts. It should have been awkward, a painful silence between two strangers. But it wasn't. It was quiet. But it was a quiet filled with a strange, fragile peace. Annie sat on a small stool beside his cot, changing a damp cloth on his forehead. She was no longer afraid of him. The monster she had seen in the forest was gone, the curse held at bay by his sheer exhaustion. All she saw now was the man, betrayed and broken, his golden eyes following her every move with a deep, aching guilt. "I'm so sorry, Annie," he finally whispered, his voice rough. "For what Cale did. For the rejection. For all of it. It wasn't your fault," she said softly, her voice thick with a fury that wasn't meant for him. "It was Lori. She's been poisoning you, Ethan, weakening you, making you think your curse was worse than it was." She told him everything she had pieced together, the scent, the tea, Laurie's constant, smothering presence. As she spoke, she saw the last pieces of confusion and self-loathing fall away from his face, replaced by a dawning horror and then a cold, quiet rage that was far more terrifying than his beast's mindless fury. He finally understood. "I thought I was saving you," he confessed, his voice cracking with emotion. "My control was slipping so badly. I felt the beast, all the time, clawing at the bars of its cage. I was so afraid I was going to hurt you. I thought if I chose her, if I made you hate me, you would be safe. I thought she would protect you." He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "I gave you to the monster to save you from myself." The devastating, painful honesty of his words broke down the last of her walls. This man had been willing to destroy himself, to destroy their one chance at happiness, all to keep her safe. The bond might be gone, but the love that had underpinned it, that was still there, stronger than ever. It was a love built not on fate, but on choice and sacrifice. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "She didn't win, Ethan. We're still here." His eyes opened and he looked at their joined hands. The air in the small cabin shifted, growing thick and warm. The emotional truth between them, now stripped bare of all the lies and manipulations, reignited the deep physical pull that had always been there. He tugged gently on her hand, pulling her closer. "Annie," he breathed, his voice thick with a need that went beyond the physical. She leaned down, and he met her, rising up slightly from the cot. Their lips met, and this time, there was no desperation, no angry hunger. It was a kiss of profound relief, of finding an anchor in a raging storm. It was slow and deep, and full of a tenderness that made her heart ache. It was the kiss of two survivors, two soldiers who had found each other in the wreckage of a war. The kiss deepened, and soon, they were lost in each other. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate act of healing and defiance. In the dusty, forgotten cabin, they came together, their bodies remembering a connection their souls were trying to find again. It was an act of quiet desperation and fierce love, a way of reclaiming the intimacy that had been stolen from them. It was emotional, raw, and achingly beautiful. As their passion crested, as he held her close, she felt the familiar, predatory shift in him. She felt his fangs lengthen, his breath hot against her neck. He moved to mark her, to bite down and reforge the bond she had broken, to make them whole again. And then he stopped. He froze, his teeth just ghosting her skin. With a shuddering breath that seemed to cost him everything, he pulled back, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't read. "What?" she whispered, confused, a fresh wave of hurt starting to build. He looked down at her, his gaze filled with a fierce, protective love that took her breath away. He gently brushed the hair from her face. "No," he whispered, his voice absolute. "The rejection was your choice, born of my betrayal. Remaking this bond has to be your choice too, a real one, not in a moment of passion, not because you feel sorry for me. It has to be because you want it, all of it, with no fear and no doubts." This act of restraint, of putting her choice above his own desperate need, was the ultimate proof of his love. It was a gift more precious than any mark, but it left them unclaimed, unbound, and vulnerable. And far away in the silent keep, Laurie was realizing that her pawns were no longer on the board, and a cornered viper is always the most dangerous. Chapter 16. The Serpent's Tongue. Hope was a fugitive. It was a fragile, hunted thing that Annie and Ethan protected in the dusty confines of the abandoned cabin. He was healing, the worst of the wounds slowly closing, the poison of the wolfsbane finally leaving his system. They made plans in hushed, urgent whispers. How to get back, how to expose Laurie, how to prove that the Alpha's instability was not a curse of the mind, but a deliberate, calculated poisoning. For the first time, they were a team, a united front against the serpent who had tried to ruin them. They were fools. They thought they had time. The warning came on the wind. A young wolf, loyal to Ethan, found them at dusk, his eyes wide with fear. "Alpha, you have to come back," he panted. "Lori has called a full pack summit. She's telling everyone you've gone mad, that you've abandoned us." They were too late. While they had been hiding and healing, Lori had been plotting and weaving her web of lies. They raced back towards the keep, moving through the forest like shadows, their hearts pounding with a dreadful premonition. They snuck in through a forgotten entrance to the tunnels that ran beneath the Great Hall, coming up behind a ventilation grate in the wall that gave them a perfect, hidden view of the assembly. The hall was packed, a sea of tense, worried faces lit by the flickering torchlight. Lori stood on the Alpha's platform, a vision in pristine white. She looked strong, concerned, and completely in control. She was playing the part of the reluctant leader, forced to step up in a time of crisis, and the pack was drinking it in. She told them a masterful story, her voice ringing with sorrow and conviction. She spoke of the Alpha's strange obsession with Annie, the traitor's daughter. She described how Annie had lured Ethan into the woods, leading to the brutal confrontation with Alpha Kyle. She twisted the truth, painting Ethan's protective rage not as an act of a mate, but as the reckless violence of an unstable leader, an act that had put the entire pack in danger. "I have tried to protect him," Lori said, a convincing tremor in her voice. "To protect all of us from the secret he has carried for so long, but I cannot stay silent any longer, not when our entire future is at stake." She paused, letting the dramatic weight of her words settle over the anxious crowd. Then, she played her winning card. "Our Alpha is sick," she announced, her voice dropping to a sorrowful whisper that still carried to every corner of the hall. "It is a sickness of the spirit, a deep fracture in his soul, passed down through his bloodline, a madness that has been growing for years." She didn't mention the wolfsbane. She didn't need to. She fed them a simpler, more terrifying lie. "His obsession with this girl," she continued, her voice rising with passion, "a known traitor's bloodline, has pushed his fractured mind over the edge. His violent, uncontrolled actions are proof. He is no longer fit to lead you. He is a danger to us all." The poison of her words spread through the pack like a disease. Fear was a far more powerful motivator than loyalty. Annie watched in horror as the faces in the crowd turned from confused to fearful, from fearful to angry. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall, growing into shouts. They believed her. Of course they did. She was offering them a simple answer to their fear, a simple monster to blame. From the shadows beside her, Annie felt Ethan flinch as if he had been physically struck. His deepest secret, the vulnerability he had guarded his entire life, was now a weapon being used to destroy him. His own pack was turning on him. He had become the monster in their stories. Annie felt the invisible weight of their hatred, their fear. They were looking at the platform, but their condemnation was aimed at her. She was the catalyst, the weakness, the outcast who had broken their king. "For the safety of this pack," Lori's voice boomed, "I ask the Council of Elders to convene. We must have a vote of no confidence. We must remove the threat." The pack roared its approval. Guards, their faces grim, began to move through the hall, their eyes searching. They were hunting their own Alpha. Beside her in the darkness, Ethan didn't make a sound, but Annie felt the moment his spirit broke. They were no longer just hiding. They were fugitives. Chapter 17. The Weight of Chains. The tunnels were cold and damp, a maze of darkness beneath the warm, vibrant life of the keep. They felt like a tomb. The shouts of the search parties echoed from above, the sound of their own pack hunting them like rats in a maze. Ethan moved like a man already dead, his face a gray, emotionless mask. The fire, the rage, the love. It had all been extinguished by Lori's public betrayal. All that was left was the hollow shell of an Alpha who had lost his pack. "We have to fight," Annie whispered, her voice fierce in the oppressive silence. They were huddled in a small, dark alcove, the sounds of the hunt drawing closer. We can run. We can go somewhere else. Start over. He finally looked at her, and his golden eyes were so empty it made her heart ache. And do what, Annie? He asked, his voice flat. Live as rogues? Hunted and alone for the rest of our lives? It's better than this. It's better than letting her win, she insisted, grabbing his arm. He gently pulled his arm away. If we run, it proves I'm guilty of everything she said. If I fight my own pack, I become the monster she described to them. He shook his head, a terrible final certainty settling on his features. It would be civil war. Our pack would tear itself apart. Families would be destroyed. Wolves would die. My wolves. He looked at her, his eyes begging her to understand. I can't let that happen. An alpha's duty is to the pack, above all else, even above himself. She saw his decision in his eyes before he even said it. He was going to surrender. He was going to walk into the viper's nest and let them chain him, all to prevent bloodshed. It was the most noble, selfless, and stupidest thing she had ever heard. She pleaded with him, her words turning to desperate, angry tears, but it was like arguing with a mountain. His path was set. Promise me you will stay hidden, he said, his voice soft but firm. Don't let them find you. Please, Annie. It's the only way I know you'll be safe. Before she could argue, he leaned in and gave her one last, gentle kiss. It was a kiss of goodbye, of endings, of ash. What we had in that cabin, it was real, he whispered against her lips. And then he was gone, a shadow melting back down the dark tunnel. She scrambled to a higher vantage point, a hidden grate that looked out onto the main courtyard. She watched, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, as he walked out into the torchlight, his hands raised in surrender. The pack warriors, his men, the wolves he had trained and led, surrounded him. They looked hesitant, ashamed, but their orders were clear. They moved in and fastened heavy silver chains around his wrists. Annie saw him flinch as the metal a werewolf's poison sizzled against his skin. The pack, drawn by the commotion, flooded into the courtyard. When they saw him in chains, they did not look ashamed. They looked triumphant. They jeered and shouted, their fear twisting into a cruel, ugly mob mentality. Beast! Someone screamed. Madman! Another yelled. A rock flew through the air, striking him in the shoulder. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his head held high, his face a mask of heartbreaking dignity, accepting their hatred as his final duty. This was her fault. The thought was a crushing weight, stealing the air from her lungs. Every choice she had made, from her rejection to her return, had led to this moment. She had brought this proud, powerful man to his knees. She was a curse. Her father's blood ran true. She had ruined him. As if summoned by her despair, Lori appeared on the steps of the Great Hall, her face a mask of perfect, sorrowful duty. She watched as Ethan was led away. Then her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the shadows of the courtyard. They paused, seeming to lock directly onto the grate where Annie was hiding. A cold smile touched her lips. She turned and walked towards the dark alleyway that led to Annie's hiding spot. She knew. She had known all along where she would be. A few moments later, Lori appeared at the end of the dark passage. A tragic but necessary spectacle, she said, her voice devoid of any real sympathy. He's been taken to the cells to await the council's judgment. She took a step closer, her eyes gleaming in the dark. But I am a merciful leader, so I will offer you a choice. She paused, savoring the moment. Leave. Disappear from these lands forever, and I will speak to the council. I will persuade them to show him mercy. Exile, perhaps, instead of execution. But if you stay, if you try to fight me, I will paint you as the dark influence that drove him mad, and I will make sure the council puts him down like the rabid dog he has become. Chapter 18. The Curse of a Name. The choice wasn't a choice. It was a perfectly crafted cage. Laurie's words echoed in the suffocating darkness of the tunnel, each one a bar slamming into place around Annie's heart. Ethan's life. Or any chance of a life with him. The ultimatum was a cruel masterpiece designed to prey on Annie's deepest, darkest fear. And it was working. She stumbled away from the grate, deeper into the tunnels, her mind a spiraling vortex of despair. The core belief that had been the foundation of her miserable life, the one she had just started to think might be wrong, came roaring back with a vengeance. She was a curse. It was the only explanation that made sense. Her father, a man of honor and loyalty, had betrayed his alpha and doomed his family. Now she, his daughter, had emerged from the shadows only to bring the next alpha to his knees. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern, a legacy of ruin passed down in their blood. Every single event of the past few weeks replayed in her mind, now seen through this dark, twisted filter. It all started with her. If she hadn't collapsed in the woods, he never would have found her. The bond would have remained a dormant, abstract thing. He would still be in control, his pack safe, his curse a manageable secret. But she had stumbled into his life, a catalyst for chaos. Her pride had made her reject him, a blow that had shattered his already fragile wolf. Her presence had provoked the fight with Cale, exposing his instability to the world. Her decision to return with him, to fight Laurie, had led directly to this, to him in chains, to Laurie in power. She was the poison, not the wolfsbane. Her love, her hope, her very existence. Laurie wasn't the monster. Laurie was just the one smart enough to see the truth and use it. Annie was a walking disaster, a magnet for tragedy. Everything she touched, she broke. Laurie's offer wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy. If she stayed, she would keep fighting for him, and she would keep making things worse, dragging him further and further down until there was nothing left of him to save. Her love wasn't a balm, it was a blade. It was the ultimate liability. How could she not see it before? He had tried to push her away from the very beginning. He had known, on some primal level, that she was his ruin. His public rejection of her hadn't been a betrayal driven by poison. It had been a moment of pure clarity. He had been trying to save himself from her. A bleak, terrible certainty settled in her soul. There was only one thing she could do, the only choice that wasn't selfish. She had to leave. She had to cut herself out of his life completely, a surgeon removing a cancerous tumor. It was the only way to save him. She would accept her fate. She was born to be an outcast, destined to be alone. Her one brief taste of belonging, of love, was a cosmic mistake that she now had to correct. This was her all-is-lost moment. Hope was not just gone. It was a ridiculous, childish fantasy she had been foolish enough to entertain. There was only the cold, hard reality of her curse. She would leave, and Laurie would show Ethan mercy. He would be exiled, perhaps, but he would be alive. He could heal. He could be free of her destructive influence. It was the most painful, selfless act she could imagine, and she embraced it with the grim resignation of a condemned prisoner walking to the gallows. She made her way through the tunnels, finding an exit that led out into the deep woods at the edge of the territory. She wouldn't even go back to her room. She would leave with nothing but the clothes on her back and the hollow void in her chest. She took one last look back at the distant lights of the keep, a place that had never truly been her home. A silent goodbye to the man she loved, the man she was leaving to save. She turned her back on it all and took her first step into a life of exile. But as her foot touched the path that led away into the darkness, something happened. A strange, powerful warmth bloomed in the dead, empty space in her chest. It wasn't the ghost of the bond, it wasn't Ethan. This was something else, something hers. It was a quiet, steady heat that spread through her veins, chasing away the cold despair. Her wolf, the sleeping beast that had been stirred by the bond and then silenced by the rejection. It was waking up again. But this time it wasn't frantic or panicked. It was rising on its own terms, with a calm, absolute certainty. It uncoiled in the center of her being, a serpent of pure, untapped power. And with its awakening came a single, clear thought, a truth that cut through all her self-hatred and fear like a bolt of lightning. "You are not the curse," it seemed to say, its voice the whisper of her own deep, forgotten strength. "You are the cure." Chapter 19. The Other Half of the Soul. The world stopped. Annie stood frozen on the path that was supposed to lead to her exile, to her lonely, cursed future. But the future felt wrong. The despair that had been a cold, heavy shroud over her soul was dissolving, burned away by a strange, quiet warmth spreading from the center of her chest. It was her wolf. She knew it with a certainty that defied all logic. It was waking up, not with the frantic, panicked energy of before, but with the slow, deep, unstoppable power of a tide turning. It uncoiled within her, a force of calm, solid strength, and with it came a whisper of truth so profound it shattered the foundations of her life. "You are not the curse." The thought was a lightning bolt, illuminating the dark, twisted lies she had believed for so long. She wasn't a walking disaster. She wasn't a legacy of ruin. The despair and self-hatred didn't just fade. They felt absurd, like a child's nightmare in the bright light of morning. You are the cure. And with that second thought, the final piece of the puzzle slid into place. It was a moment of absolute, breathtaking clarity. Ethan's wolf wasn't just fractured. It was incomplete. It was a raging, uncontrolled fire because it lacked the very thing that was meant to temper it. It was a storm without a center, a sky without the earth. She felt the nature of her own wolf now, the one she had thought was weak or non-existent. It wasn't weak. It was calm. It was a deep, grounding power, an anchor made of bedrock and ancient forests. It was the other half of his. They weren't just two souls fated to be together. Their very beasts, the primal cores of their beings, were two halves of a single, balanced whole. The curse hadn't created a monster inside him. It had simply broken off the part of his soul that she was meant to complete, leaving the other half wild and unbalanced. Her rejection hadn't been an act of power that destroyed him. It had been the act of an anchor cutting its own rope, leaving the ship to be torn apart by the storm. All his life, he had been fighting a war with one arm because the other arm was her. This new truth was a revolution. It reframed everything. Her father's betrayal? What if that was a lie too? What if his story had been twisted, his legacy poisoned, all to ensure that his daughter, the future anchor to an alpha's power, would grow up weak, disconnected, and believing herself to be worthless? It was a plan so deep, so insidious, it had spanned a generation. She had been kept isolated and powerless because someone, somewhere, knew what she was. They knew that a balanced alpha, an alpha made whole by his true mate, would be unbreakable. Her purpose was not to run. It was not to sacrifice herself by disappearing. Her purpose was to fight, to run back into the heart of the storm and be the anchor he so desperately needed. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. All the years of cowering and hiding were over. In their place was a cold, hard resolve that felt as solid as the earth itself. She was not the traitor's daughter anymore. She was the other half of the alpha's soul, and she was going back to claim what was hers. She turned away from the lonely path of exile. Her back was straight, her head held high. With her newfound power thrumming under her skin, a quiet, steady drumbeat of purpose, she headed back towards the keep. She had to get to Ethan, she had to face the council, and she had to tear Laurie's web of lies to shreds. Chapter 20. A Voice of Truth. The tunnels beneath the keep were no longer a place of fear and hiding. They were a path. With her wolf now awake and aware, the darkness was not empty. Annie's senses were sharp, clear, a fine-tuned instrument. She could smell the fear and confusion that clung to the pack like a second skin. Laurie's rule was a brittle thing, built on a foundation of lies, and it was already starting to crack. Annie could feel it. She could also feel a faint, throbbing pain in the distance. Ethan, alone in a cell, the burning silver chains eating at his strength. The thought sent a surge of cold fury through her. She learned from the whispers of passing guards that the 3-pack elders were meeting in the old council chamber to decide Ethan's fate. It was a secret meeting, a last-ditch effort to prevent a civil war. This was her chance. She couldn't fight Laurie's guards, but she could fight her with the truth. She walked out of the tunnels and straight to the chamber door, her steps silent but sure. She didn't knock. She pushed the heavy stone door open and walked inside. The chamber fell silent. The 3 elders, ancient wolves whose faces were maps of time and wisdom, looked up from the central table in shock. Laurie, who stood at the head of the table like a queen, spun around, her face twisting into a mask of pure fury. "Guards!" she shrieked. "Seize her!" 2 guards moved towards Annie, but the eldest of the council, a she-wolf named Alara, whose silver hair was braided with raven feathers, raised a single wrinkled hand. "Wait," she commanded, her voice quiet but filled with an authority that stopped the guards in their tracks. Alara's pale, intelligent eyes fixed on Annie. "You are bold, child, to walk in here. Speak. Tell us why we should not have you thrown in the cells alongside the man you have ruined." This was it. Annie stood tall, her new, calm strength a shield around her. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was clear and strong. "You are about to condemn a man for a crime he did not commit, based on the word of the woman who orchestrated his downfall." She told them everything. She started with the subtle, systematic poisoning, her voice ringing with conviction. She described the wolfsbane, the calming tease, the way Laurie had twisted Ethan's curse into a weapon, deliberately weakening him over weeks and months. She explained the true nature of their bond, how her own power was meant to be his anchor, a truth that had been hidden from her entire life. She admitted to the rejection, her voice thick with regret. "I broke the bond because I believed her lies," she said, her gaze locking with Laurie's. "She made me believe I was a curse. She made Ethan believe he was a monster. She isolated us both and then pushed us into a cage of fear and self-loathing." Laurie scoffed. "These are the mad ramblings of a desperate girl. She's a traitor's bloodline. She's trying to save her lover." But Annie didn't back down. She looked at the elders, her expression earnest and open. "You are judging an alpha who has been fighting a war on 2 fronts his entire life, against a curse within, and against a serpent coiled at his side. Is that the justice of the Silver Moon Pack?" The elders were silent, their ancient eyes thoughtful. The accusation was huge, but Annie's conviction was absolute. Alara, the old she-wolf, slowly turned her gaze to Laurie. Her eyes were sharp, piercing, missing nothing. "Beta Laurie," she asked, her voice deceptively gentle, "is it true that you have been administering your own private remedies to the alpha?" Laurie, for the very first time, looked flustered. Her smooth, confident facade finally cracked. I was only trying to help him. He was under so much stress." Her denial was too quick, too loud. Her scent, which had been so calm and controlled, spiked with the sharp, sour tang of fear. The elders saw it. They exchanged a look. They didn't need a confession. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was taking root. Alara stood. "The alpha's sentences stayed," she declared, her voice final. "These are grave accusations that must be investigated." She looked at the guards. "Release Ethan from the silver chains. Confine him to his chambers under guard until we have the truth." It was a victory. A small one, but it was enough. Laurie's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her control was gone. As the guards led Annie from the chamber, not to a cell, but towards the Alpha's wing, she knew this was far from over. An investigation would take time. Laurie would not wait for the truth to be uncovered. She would act now. The final bloody confrontation was coming. Chapter 21. The Coming Storm. The doors to the Alpha's chambers felt different this time. The last time Annie had been here, she had woken up a prisoner in a cage of silk and fear. Now, she was walking in as a liberator. Ethan was already there, standing by the large window, looking out over the packlands. The raw red burns from the silver chains were still on his wrists, but his shoulders were straight. He turned as she entered, and when his eyes met hers, she saw the flicker of his spirit returning, a flame being coaxed back to life in the darkness. He saw the change in her immediately. The fearful, haunted girl was gone. In her place was a woman who stood with a calm, unshakable strength that seemed to radiate from her very core. "Annie?" he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief and a dawning wonder. She went to him, her heart aching at the sight of his wounds, but her spirit soaring. "The council is listening," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They're investigating Lori." She told him everything, about her realization in the forest, about the true nature of their connection. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "I'm not your weakness, Ethan. I never was. I'm your anchor. We are two halves of a whole." The truth of her words settled over him, a revelation that reframed his entire, tormented life. The curse wasn't a sentence to be a monster. It was a challenge to find his other half. He wasn't a warrior who had been fighting with a broken sword. He was a warrior who had simply been missing his shield. A slow, wondering smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his harsh face, making him look younger, freer. He covered her hand with his own, a silent acknowledgement of their new reality. Their moment of peace was shattered. The doors to the chamber burst open and the young, loyal wolf who had warned them in the cabin stumbled in, his face pale with panic. "Alpha! It's Lori!" he gasped. "She's telling everyone the elders are bewitched, that Annie used dark magic on them. She's gathering the guards loyal to her. She's coming to seize power by force. She's coming to kill you both." The coup. It was happening. Now. A fire ignited in Ethan's eyes. It was the Alpha's fire, but it was different this time. It wasn't the wild, uncontrolled rage of the beast. It was a clear, focused flame, tempered by the calm, steady presence of Annie beside him. He drew strength from her, and she from him. He straightened to his full height, no longer the broken prisoner, but the true alpha of the Silver Moon Pack. He turned to the handful of loyal warriors who had followed the young wolf into the room, their faces grim but resolute. "Lori has betrayed this pack," Ethan's voice rang out, filled with a power they hadn't heard in years. "She poisoned your alpha. She lied to you. Now she seeks to rule this pack through murder and fear." He looked at each of them, his gaze unwavering. "Will you stand by and let a serpent claim our home?" A unified, defiant roar was his answer. The battle lines were drawn. The time for hiding was over. Annie stood beside Ethan, not behind him. They were not just a fated pair anymore. They were partners. Leaders. He was the sword, and she was the anchor that gave him the balance to wield it. He looked down at her, a silent question in his eyes. She answered with a determined nod. They were in this together, until the very end. He turned and strode towards the great doors of the chamber, the loyal warriors falling into formation behind him. Annie walked at his side, her hand in his. They threw the doors open, ready to face the storm that was about to break upon their home. The final battle had begun. Chapter 22. Two Halves of a Storm. The hallway outside the Alpha's chambers became a battleground. It was a chaotic, desperate clash of claw and tooth, of loyalty and betrayal. Ethan's small band of warriors fought with the ferocity of wolves defending their home, but Lori's forces were greater in number, their eyes filled with the righteous fire of her lies. Ethan was a whirlwind of controlled fury at the center of it all. He moved with a grace and power Annie had never seen, the fractured beast and the cold alpha finally working as one. And Annie stayed right beside him. She was not a warrior. She had no training, no skill with a blade, but she had a calm, clear mind, and she had her wolf. She felt the flow of the battle, saw openings and weaknesses. She would shove a heavy tapestry rack into the path of charging guards. trip a wolf with a well-placed piece of furniture, her voice a steady, calming presence for their fighters amidst the roar of combat. She was the eye of his storm, the anchor that kept his incredible power focused and precise, preventing the mindless rage from taking over. For a while, it was enough. They were holding their ground. But Lori was smart. She knew she couldn't win a direct fight against a true alpha who was no longer fighting himself. So she changed the target. While Ethan was occupied with two of Lori's biggest guards, the blonde beta moved with a serpent's speed, slipping through the fray. Annie saw her coming too late. Lori slammed into her, and they both went down. Lori was a ruthless, skilled fighter. She twisted, her weight pinning Annie to the cold stone floor. Something cold and sharp pressed against Annie's throat, a silver knife. "It's over, Ethan!" Lori screamed, her voice triumphant and shrill over the sounds of the fight. The battle faltered, all eyes turning to them. "Surrender now, or your precious mate dies on this floor." The knife pressed deeper, and a thin line of fire bloomed on Annie's skin. The scent of her own blood, sharp and coppery, filled the air. Across the hall, Ethan threw a warrior aside and turned. He saw the knife at Annie's throat. He saw the blood. And his control, the fragile, newfound balance, shattered into a million pieces. His eyes exploded with a light so bright, so golden, it was like staring into the sun. A roar of pure, untamed agony and rage ripped from his chest, a sound that was not human, a sound that was not wolf. It was the sound of the curse, unleashed in its ultimate, final form. The beast was free. It was more powerful, more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. But as Annie lay pinned beneath her enemy, looking into the eyes of the monster that wore the face of the man she loved, she felt no fear. She felt the thrum of their connection, the pull of two souls that were meant to be one. She was the other half of that storm. She would not let it break him. Lori laughed, a wild, crazed sound. "You see? He's nothing but a monster. He'll kill you himself." But Annie wasn't looking at Lori. Her eyes were locked on Ethan's. As the beast gathered itself for a final world-ending charge, she did the one thing no one expected. She relaxed. She stopped fighting. And she poured every ounce of love, trust, and certainty she possessed into her voice. "Ethan!" she shouted, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the chaos. "It's okay. I'm right here. I trust you." She took a deep breath, offering him the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate act of faith. "If you kill me, at least you'll be free from it all." Her words, her absolute, unconditional trust were the key. They were the anchor the beast had been missing its entire life. The mindless, golden rage in his eyes faltered. The curse, a creature of fear and pain, had no defense against an act of pure, selfless love. The raging storm inside him didn't break. It settled. The beast's raw power and the man's conscious soul finally, completely, merged into one. The curse was broken. He was whole. He moved faster than light. One moment he was across the hall. The next he was there. His hand shot out, grabbing Lori's wrist with a crunch of bone. He threw her aside like a broken doll. The battle was over. He knelt beside Annie, his eyes no longer burning, but glowing with a clear, warm, golden light. He was beautiful. He was hers. He gently touched the cut on her neck, his expression filled with a love so profound it made her heart ache. Then, as the last of Lori's supporters dropped their weapons in surrender, he leaned down and did what he had denied himself for so long. He bit down, his fangs sinking into the soft skin of her neck. It wasn't a bite of possession or anger. It was a bite of completion. A wave of pure, radiant, healing energy exploded from the mark, washing over them, over the hall, over the entire pack. The bond, once broken by lies and fear, was now reforged forever by choice, trust, and love. Chapter 23. The Quiet Earth. The Great Hall was a landscape of aftermath. The fighting had stopped. leaving behind the heavy silence of surrender and the metallic tang of blood in the air. Laurie's defeated warriors were on their knees, disarmed, their faces a mixture of shame and disbelief. Laurie herself was bound in silver chains, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of spitting, impotent rage. The serpent had been defanged. Ethan, with Annie at his side, stood before the entire pack which had gathered in the wake of the battle. The new whole mark on Annie's neck throbbed with a gentle, calming warmth. Ethan looked tired, wounded, but he also looked more complete than she had ever seen him. The haunted, tormented man was gone for good. He told them everything. He spoke of the curse, of the dark magic that had fractured his wolf. He told them of Laurie's long, slow poisoning, her cruel manipulation that had twisted his pain into a weapon. He didn't make excuses or ask for pity. He stood before them, their alpha, and owned his truth. "I was broken," he said, his voice clear and strong, "and in that brokenness, I failed to see the truth. I failed to see the enemy at my side, and I failed to see the Savior before me." His golden eyes found Annie's, and the love in them was a physical force. "I take responsibility for that failure." The effort, after the battle and the breaking of a lifelong curse, was too much. His legs buckled and he collapsed to his knees, his body finally surrendering to its wounds and exhaustion. A collective gasp went through the pack. Their alpha, who had just saved them, was falling. But Annie was there. She didn't panic. She knelt in front of him, her calm a steadying presence in the tense hall. She placed her hands on his chest, and through their new, unbreakable bond, she poured her own strength into him, her quiet, grounding energy. The pack could almost see it, a soft, invisible light flowing from her to him, stabilizing him, healing him. He was not dying. He was finally, truly, beginning to heal. And a strange, wonderful thing happened. As Annie tended to her mate, the pack's attention shifted. They weren't looking at their fallen alpha with fear or pity anymore. They were looking at her. They saw the outcast, the traitor's daughter, kneeling not in submission but in strength. They saw the quiet, unassuming girl who had walked into the lion's den, who had faced down their fears with the truth, and who had become the anchor that saved them all. Ilara, the old wise elder, stepped forward from the crowd. She walked slowly, her ancient eyes fixed on Annie. She stopped before them, and with a grace that defied her age, bowed her head low. "Luna," she said, her voice filled with a deep, profound reverence. It was a title. It was a recognition. It was an acceptance. Inspired by her act, another wolf knelt, then another, then, like a wave, the entire pack, warriors, healers, families, sank to their knees. They bowed their heads, not just to the alpha, but to the woman who had made him whole. They were not bowing to a fated mate. They were bowing to their Luna, a leader who had earned their respect not through power or bloodline, but through courage, love, and a strength of spirit that had saved them from the brink of destruction. Laurie was dragged away by the guards, her hateful curses fading down the hall. The healing of the Silver Moon pack had begun, and it would be led by the woman they had once thrown to the wolves. Chapter 24. A Crown of Choice. A week felt like a lifetime. In 7 short days, the fragile piece in the Silver Moon pack began to mend itself into something stronger than before. The Great Hall was cleaned, the wounds of the battle were healing, and the poison of Laurie's lies was being systematically rooted out by the simple, cleansing power of the truth. Laurie, after a swift trial before the elders, had been stripped of her rank and exiled to the desolate lands to the north, a fate of lonely survival that was a fitting punishment for the woman who had tried to isolate and destroy their alpha. Ethan was transformed. With the curse broken and the bond to Annie now a steady, warm river of strength in his soul, he was the leader he was always meant to be. The coldness was gone, replaced by a calm, confident warmth. He smiled now. He laughed. The haunted look in his golden eyes had been replaced by a light that was all for her. He found her in the dusty, quiet library, the place where he had first shared his deepest secret. She was running her fingers over the spine of an old book, and she turned with a smile as he entered. He was holding something in his hands. It was the Alpha's circlet, a simple ancient crown of twisted silver and dark iron, worn by the leaders of their pack for generations. "The pack is healing," he said, his voice soft. "They look at me and they see their Alpha whole and strong again. They are ready to follow me." He took a step closer, his eyes serious and filled with an emotion so deep it made her breath catch. "But I've realized something. This," he gestured to the circlet in his hands, "the title, the power. It means nothing to me if I don't have you to share it with. The old way, the way of an Alpha who rules and a Luna who stands beside him, it's not enough. Not for us." He stopped in front of her, but he didn't place the crown on his own head. Instead, with a reverence that made her heart ache, he held it out to her. He placed the cool, heavy weight of it into her hands. "The pack chose me as their Alpha," he said, his voice thick with love. "But I choose you, Annie. Over all of it. I would burn this pack to ash if it meant I could keep you." It wasn't a threat of destruction. It was a vow of devotion. By placing the symbol of his power in her hands, he was making her his true, undisputed equal. He was offering her not just his heart, but his throne. Her journey was complete. She had started as the outcast, the girl who believed she was a curse. Now she stood here, a queen. Not because fate had decreed it, but because she had fought for it, and because the man she loved had chosen her, freely and completely. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of a joy so profound she had never known it could exist. She was not just a mate. She was a partner. She was home. 1 year later, they stood on the great balcony of the keep, looking out over a land that was thriving. The Alpha's circlet was gone. In its place, they each wore a simple, elegant bracer on their right wrist, one of silver, one of iron, forged from the metal of the old crown. They were two rulers, bound together. The Silver Moon pack was stronger, more loyal, and more prosperous than it had been in a century, led by an Alpha of immense power and a Luna of unshakable wisdom. Annie leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, the solid warmth of him a constant, comforting presence. He wrapped his arm around her, his fingers lacing with hers. She was no longer the traitor's daughter, no longer the pack's ghost. She was Luna, loved by her mate, and respected by her people. She had walked through the deepest darkness and found not only the other half of her soul, but the truest, strongest version of herself. She had not been chosen by fate. She had met fate, wrestled it to the ground, and forged a new one in its place for both of them.